Americans at mid-century faced two kinds of fears of authoritarianism. There was, on the one hand, the basic concern that people would be either communists or fascists, or, if not either, they might be incipient communists or fascists, and become at a future date true communists or fascists. These folks are the irrational ones. These are the people who either join the Communist Party or the American Anti-Communist Party. These are the people who see communists under every bed. Why are they a problem? On the one hand, there's the problem of subversion. And then there's the problem that the actual authoritarians make the country weak. So the question was America likely to become fascist? One answer to this question was only if the true authoritarians take over. In this view, authoritarians are abnormal and a small minority, but they might take over the country. Another way of answering this question is, how common is conformity? Maybe it's not only communists and fascists who are illogical conformists, bad scientists, and so on, but perhaps it's almost anybody who is marginally outside the mainstream who is a conformist. We should note that this is the very production of homogeneous conformity. Social scientists held that if you disagree with centrist politics, your views don't count. They are illogical by definition. On this view, protest against the system is itself closed-minded and irrational. But if some social scientists thought that political protest was irrational, whether the protest was from the right or the left, other social scientists took the opposite view. They held that all conformity of any type was a problem. Even if people with mainstream politics shared their views, it could still be a problem. Why was this? Well, to answer, we should look to the best-selling sociologist David Reesman to find out. To Reesman and to the millions who read him, it is too much similarity with peers or with parents that defines conformity. It is this kind of conformity that means not being your own person. These people had their fears activated by what they called mass society. What did mass society look like to them? What did they think about when they talked about mass society? For social scientists who were concerned about mass society, the first thing they thought about was the large-scale rallies of the Nazi Party in the 1930s. They thought about the throngs of uniform, undifferentiated people who had lost their own ability to think for themselves. The social scientists thought about these Nazis who had lost their own individuality in the virtual worship of the totalitarian government of Adolf Hitler. Scenes of this kind of mass, of the worship of authoritarian government, were promoted by propaganda produced by the Nazis themselves. The Nazis had intended these films to indicate the power of Germany and to all the world. However, these very same propaganda films were also horrifying to the rest of the world, and they were so horrifying that the Allies used these same clips in motivational films that they made for U.S. troops in World War II. These images of mass rallies in Germany helped explain to armed forces in America why Nazi Germany was so horrible and why it was worth dying to defeat Hitler. How did this look on the home front of the United States? What did mass society mean in the U.S.? The concern sketched by Reesman and similar social scientists was not that America would turn into a Nazi country, but it was only in part that the U.S. would go authoritarian. The larger concern, or the more common concern, was that conformity was contrary to the values of individualism that had made America strong in the first place. To Reesman, the nature of America could best be understood in terms of the personality of the average person. He argued that in the past, people were what he called inner-directed. The men Reesman was concerned with, and generally it was men he focused on, these men developed an internal gyroscope acquired from their parents or from religious institutions. As Reesman's readers thought, this inner-directed man was the kind of person who would strike out on the frontier, who was a captain of industry, who founded companies, and who really didn't care what other people thought about him. On the other hand, the so-called other-directed person was very concerned about what other people thought, and he navigated not with a gyroscope that kept him upright and oriented, but with a radar set that helped him understand what other people thought. This other-directed man was not a captain of industry, but a middle-level office worker. This man was not defined by his life on the frontier, but by the focus on material gain and consumer products. This kind of man, and the country he centered, was defined by homogeneity of clothes, of family life, of houses, and of new consumer technologies. It was, in significant ways, defined by a new version of the American dream. The post-World War II period saw a new version of the American dream. It was one that was defined by consumer prosperity, a kind of prosperity and even of homogeneity that had suggested mass society to the readers of David Reisman. It was a form of the American dream that was defined by a set of material and social technologies, from the material televisions to refrigerators and cars, and the social technologies of consumer credit. These together moved, along with central aspects of the Cold War, moved America, or rather white America, to the suburbs and to the middle-class life, and even to the stereotypical vision of the American baby boom. So the new version of the American dream was defined by consumerism and materialism. In order for the American dream to be fulfilled, it was necessary to promote consumerism by all parts of American life. The argument was that family status must improve in order for American life in general to get better. So consumption became a national responsibility. In this vein, Life magazine in 1960 argued that health and decency, a proper standard of these for everyone, required that every American family have a material standard of life. They should have not only a roof over their heads, but also a set of consumer goods, including new technologies such as a washing machine, matching dishes, and a telephone. In this new era of prosperity, mechanical refrigerator ownership went from 44 to 80% of the population between 1940 and 1950. Similarly, car ownership expanded. New car sales expanded 4 times between 46 and 55. By the end of this period, 75% of families owned at least one car. In fact, by 1965, 1/6 of the jobs in the U.S. were linked to the domestic auto market. Reflecting this focus on material prosperity, Bride magazine, a magazine devoted to selling weddings, argued, "When you buy the dozens of things you never bought before, you are helping to build a greater security for the industries of this country. What you buy and how you buy is very vital in your new life and to our whole American way of life." So Bride magazine told the brides-to-be, which read it. Consumerism was not just a trend or a cultural movement, but actively promoted by government. The government promoted the GI Bill and the FHA, and together these bills and government promoted housing by subsidizing mortgages. It provided subsidies for building homes, and it focused on particular kinds of homes, those for owning, not renting. This was called a market solution that was actually subsidized by the government. A consequence of this government support was that residential construction grew by over 40%. By 1960, in fact, 62% of Americans own their own homes versus only 44% in 1940. By the end of this period, suburban people outnumbered both urban and rural people. So why did this shift happen? Part of the reason is that the government, in fact, created a new kind of mortgage. Together, the Federal Housing Administration and the VA mortgages covered the entire equity of a house or close to it, whereas previously, bank mortgages covered only portions of equity, and they were paid over only 10 to 15-year periods, whereas the VA and FHA loans covered 20 to 30 years. Before the FHA and the VA were involved, banks could not or would not lend to purchasers for the 20 to 30-year period that most people needed to buy their own houses. Ultimately, the Veterans Administration, or VA, was responsible for carrying out the GI Bill's provisions. The GI Bill provided for education, training, loan guarantees for homes to farms and businesses, and for unemployment pay to former GIs. Before the war, college and home ownership were, for the most part, unreachable dreams to the average American. But thanks to the GI Bill, millions who would have flooded the job market after World War II instead opted for education. In the peak year of 1947, veterans accounted for 50% of college admissions. By the end of the original GI Bill ended, on July 25, 1956, 7.8 million of 16 million World War II veterans had participated in an education or training program. Millions also took advantage of the GI Bill's home loan guarantee. From 44 to 52, the VA backed 2.4 million home loans for World War II veterans. Because of the linked policies of the FHA, GI Bill, and banks, these policies promoted uniform and homogeneous suburbs. Why was this? It was because the GI Bill promoted loans to servicemen. The FHA essentially only insured loans to all white neighborhoods and to suburbs. So taxpayer dollars went into creating all-white homogeneous suburbs. On the other hand, if they had wanted to move into these suburbs, black servicemen could not get loans from the FHA, the VA, or banks to do so. The GI Bill's educational benefits also largely went to white men. The GI Bill went to 16 million men and women by law. It provided a jumpstart to the post-war economy, but it favored certain Americans over others. Why did men receive most of the benefits? Because those who had served in the armed forces were more men than women. So while taxpayers paid for mortgages and college for these men, women were largely shut out of these benefits, unless they were married. Why was it that white men received college benefits? Because the GI Bill paid college costs for people who had served. Women didn't serve as much in battle or in the armed forces, and even if they had worked on the home front to support the war, they were ineligible to receive the benefits. Indeed, women were prevented by law and policy from serving in many parts of the armed forces, so only 2% of vets were women. Thus, taxpayers supported the men who had served by paying for their colleges. On the whole, these practices meant the exclusion of women from colleges. Women, indeed, couldn't even get benefits if they were married by law. Men also received $90 a month from the GI Bill, but women only received $45 a month. There was also a GI Bill provision which gave $20 a week for a year to men, but this was a provision that didn't apply to women. Women were also largely excluded from college benefits because even co-ed colleges like Cornell scaled back on admissions of women. At the beginning of the war, or before it, 50% of admission spots went to women, but at the end of the war, Cornell reserved only 20% of its spots for women. If we look at on a regional level, consider Seattle, where the proportion of women who went to college went from 20% in 1940 down to 14% in 1947. And at the post-college level, in medical and engineering schools, schools that had begun admitting women for the first time before the war stopped after the war. Similarly, women who had been in charge of newspapers, yearbooks, and student governments in colleges lost these spots to men when servicemen returned from the war. If we consider the racial aspect of this, we also see how the GI Bill worked. To receive the benefit for college, service members first had to gain admission to college, whichever college they hoped to go to. So to use benefits at places like GW or the University of Virginia or Alabama or Texas, GIs would have to be admitted. But many colleges were restricted to whites, and many private colleges, especially the most elite, were restricted to men. So many black servicemen were unable to use their GI benefits, either because they could not be admitted to college for racial reasons, or because, also for reasons of race, they could not get an FHA or GI Bill mortgage for suburban houses in neighborhoods that were, by contract, whites only. There was a parallel development in consumer credit. Consumer credit grew by 11-fold between 1945 and 1960, and installment credit in this period grew by 19-fold. Much of this credit, that is, borrowing to buy things, was for cars. In 1955, Life magazine identified a revolution in which, instead of saving for years to avoid major purchases, consumers could buy on credit and enjoy the goods while they continued to pay for them. So during this period, more than 50% of household goods and 60% of cars were bought on credit. This meant that, in fact, that the rate of debt increased faster than income grew. In the same period, there was a new invention, credit cards, which were devoted to universal, not associated with specific business credits. The first credit card was Diners Club in 1949, and it was swiftly copied by American Express, Hilton, Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan. Because of this expansion of consumer credit, there was an expansion of bankruptcies by wage earners. In fact, during the Depression, only 35% of bankruptcies were by wage earners. The rest were by business owners. But in 1958, 85% of bankruptcies were by wage earners. So we see the expansion of a new consumer economy fueled by credit for houses, credit for cars, and consumer goods. But it was something that was ultimately a male thing. And this was not a matter of choice for women. Aside of being shut out of the GI Bill and FHA loans, women were also excluded from the new forms of wealth management and credit that had actually been recently invented. One reason was that credit cards were not for women. Their names were on cards, and they could only be offered if their husbands were co-signers. So the men were doing major purchases of these items that were bought on credit. And in fact, mortgage lenders refused to count women's income as a part of backing for mortgage loans. And the VA encouraged this. Women who were to receive a mortgage loan were required to receive so-called baby letters from their doctors stating that these women were sterile on birth control or promised to get an abortion if they became pregnant all the way into the 1970s. And the reason for this was that mortgage lenders thought that women who might become pregnant would be incapable of providing the income to back the mortgage. So in 1957, 2/3 of families carried debt. Half of those families had debt from installment buying. And the consequence of all of this was the creation of a new feature of American life. This was a racially homogeneous suburb populated by male-headed nuclear families. So public finance, racist and sexist bank policies, government-supported loans, and consumer credit practices collaborated to make for a post-war America that had a particular homogeneous image. So too did the Cold War itself. Indeed, the Cold War figured largely in the promotion of suburbia. Suburbs were seen by policymakers as a better way of protecting the population from a nuclear strike. If people were concentrated in cities, then they would be more vulnerable to nuclear attack than if they were dispersed. The second reason why the Cold War was connected to the creation of suburbs was because of the creation of the interstate highway system. It was for defense purposes that the U.S. launched the interstate highway systems. This was on the grounds that if it was ever under attack, the U.S. would need to move its ground troops around quickly enough that existing roads would be insufficient. These new interstate highways helped provide the necessary infrastructure that made suburbs possible. So Cold War policy of the construction of roads, Cold War policy of the dispersal of population into suburbs, policies for supporting home loans, policies for supporting consumer credit created the suburban household. But it also became a part of an ideological struggle. So important were the consumer goods that filled American homes that it featured in a famous debate between then Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in 1959. The debate was over which system was better, American or Soviet. Khrushchev contended that the Soviet system was better because women were free to have jobs and work in the USSR. He argued that they were more equal with men in Soviet society than women were with men in the United States. Nixon replied that America was better because women did not need to go to work in the United States. And even better, he said, these women did not have to work much at home either. They did not have to work hard at home because they possessed the new consumer technologies like dishwashers.